Earlier this week, Donald Trump was inaugurated again as President of the United States. Back in November, when I woke up to the news that Kamala Harris had lost the elections, what I felt was despair and that all hope had been lost. But then I thought, how could that be? Sure, as our guest for today's episode puts it, the next 4 years are going to be a wild ride.
Well, it's going to be a wild ride. There's no question about it. I think in the way they seem ready to break a lot of dishes. So we say the bull in the china shop is an American expression. You could let the bull into the china shop and he breaks a lot of dishes. I'm hoping that there will be opportunities to make progress on key issues that are of concern and interest to me.
There is no way of sugarcoating the turbulent period that started on Monday, but I do remain hopeful in the architecture that was built in the post-World War II. I remain hopeful in the democratic institutions that we've been strengthening for centuries, in the global coalitions to fight climate change, and in the movement to protect and advance fundamental rights. That is why we decided to kickstart Policy Voices in 2025 with a series on how to not lose hope under Trump 2.0.
I think it is important for the United States to remain involved and engaged in NATO, but I also think it is healthy that now the European Union is thinking more seriously about defense policy and how to put more resources into defense in the union setting, in the EU setting. So I think those are both important points.
From Friends of Europe, this is Policy Voices. I'm Catarina Vila Nova. Today on the show, the resilience of NATO and the future of European security and defense. I'm joined by Rose Gottemoeller, former Deputy Secretary General of NATO and former Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security at the US Department of State. I spoke with Rose a couple weeks ago, and let me tell you, it was no easy feat to not lose hope on the future of security and defense in 2025. But Rose reminded me of everything we have to look forward to. Here's my conversation with Rose Gottemoeller. 2016 was a year that two things happened that are of particular importance for our conversation today. Everyone will remember that it was the year that Trump was first elected President of the United States. And as some of our listeners may not know, Rose, it was also the year that you started your tenure as NATO's Deputy Secretary General. Rose, can you take us back to that year, to that period in NATO's corridors when Trump's policies were not yet well known? What was the mood like back then? Cautious optimism? Let's wait and see.
It was astonishment, Catarina, because nobody was expecting Trump to be elected, least of all me. He was elected less than a month after I arrived at NATO. And I remember going into Secretary General Stoltenberg's office. He was my boss at the time, the morning after the election results were announced. And the two of us were completely astonished. Frankly, he gave me a big hug and said, well, we will have a lot to do. And he was absolutely right, because we did not really know what Mr. Trump's agenda was going to be, how tough his agenda was going to be toward NATO. He'd been critical of the alliance during his first election campaign, but not nearly the extent of the criticism that came our way later on. So it was a moment of just complete astonishment. And also across the quarters of NATO, people did not know what to expect, and they were just amazed and I would say a bit overwhelmed there in November of 2016.
Exactly. I can imagine that the feeling now is not quite the same. It was not so much of a shock that Donald Trump was again elected as president. Perhaps the feelings is more of a disappointment. You're no longer with NATO, but all these years later, we can somehow know what to expect from Trump given his first tenure, or is he unpredictable as ever?
He did sharpen his tone toward NATO during this election campaign, famously saying last February that if NATO members do not pay up, Putin can do whatever the hell he wants with NATO members. He's threatened several times during the campaign to withdraw from NATO. At other times, he said, no, we're not going to withdraw. We just want NATO members to pay more. So Trump has sharpened his tone. He's sharpened his threats against NATO, I would say. But on the flip side, NATO member states are more accustomed to that. They lived through previous periods during his first term of some very, very tough behavior when he really did threaten to walk away from NATO, threaten not to fulfill the U.S. Article 5 commitments to NATO member states who did not pay up. And furthermore, NATO member states have done a lot over the last 8 years to improve their performance in terms of their defense budgets coming to the 2% of GDP mark, and even agreeing among NATO member states that 2% of GDP should not be a ceiling, but should be a floor. And so NATO member states should be willing to go above it. At this moment, that seems to me to be one of Putin. Freudian slip. That seems to be one of Trump's key demands, that the NATO member states go above 2% of GDP. And I understand just from reading news reports, I haven't been in Brussels lately, but reading news reports that NATO member states are thinking of perhaps being willing to go as high as 3% of GDP by the time the member states meet at the Hague summit coming up in this coming year. Trump has put on the table a demand for 5% of GDP going to defense expenditures. Well, I think and hope that this will be a number that can be negotiated. We will see.
Absolutely. So, can we even make the argument that this whole really want he take the US out of NATO, can it that actually be a reason for optimism? Because it is pushing EU member states that perhaps have been way too cozy under the United States to ramp up their defense budgets.
I do think that the United States is still prima inter pares in NATO, first among equals, and particularly through its provision of leadership in the NATO alliance, but also provision of key military enablers that would be very difficult for NATO member states, EU member states to acquire in any time soon. Things like the capability for major satellite communications, the capability to refuel aircraft, the capability to move large numbers of men and personnel and material around, particularly in the case of the United States, being able to reinforce from the continental United States. These are capabilities that other NATO member states just don't possess to the same degree, these military enablers, so it would take a huge investment. But the leadership issue, to my mind, is paramount. And when you think about it, what European member state would step forward to take that role of leadership within the alliance or within the European Union on defense and security matters? And so I think it is important for the United States to remain involved and engaged in NATO. But I also think it is healthy that now the European Union is thinking more seriously about defense policy and how to put more resources into defense in the union setting, in the EU setting. So I think those are both important points.
And how hopeful are you that now the alliance has Mark Rutte at its helm? He has been lauded as the Trump whisperer. Could he perhaps have better results than your previous boss, Jens Stoltenberg?
Well, I don't know if he'll be better than Jens Stoltenberg. Jens Stoltenberg, I watched him with Trump in the first Trump administration, and he was super at communicating with the president. And, Trump really is a businessman. He considers himself a businessman. And Jens Stoltenberg was very, very good at presenting him numbers and saying, look, Mr. President, so many more hundreds of millions of dollars have come into the alliance due to your pressure on the allies, and really showing him the numbers. And that, I think, was a very effective communication tool with Trump. So I simply advise the current Secretary General Mark Rutte to be thinking in terms of crunching those numbers and making sure that they can be presented to the president, because it is an impressive picture. NATO member states are stepping up to this responsibility, and as I mentioned earlier, are willing to go even further than 2% of GDP. So this is an important message to get across. I will agree, though, that Mark Rutte, I was impressed even back in June of 2018 when we had a very difficult summit meeting with Mr. Trump at NATO headquarters. And I was very worried as Deputy Secretary General at that moment that he was going to essentially get up and leave the summit meeting. And that would have been a very, very difficult, I would say, even crisis for the alliance. But instead, Mark Rutte joined Jens Stoltenberg and several other leaders around the NATO table to talk to Mr. Trump to say, look, we understand what your concerns are. We are taking this responsibility seriously, and to really bring the temperature down in the room. And Rutte played a very important role there. So I was impressed at that time. And I said to myself, even in June of 2018, I bet he could be a good successor for Jens Stoltenberg. And so it turned out.
Do you feel that Biden is leaving the alliance and internally within the US, the importance of being a member of NATO in a position strong enough to survive under Trump?
The US public, and importantly on Capitol Hill, there is strong bipartisan support for the NATO alliance. And I think people do in general, both in Washington, but also across the country, recognize the importance of U.S. allies, the importance of our alliance structures in Europe as well as in Asia. And so I think that the president has to think carefully if he's going to in any way threaten that commitment to our allies, because he would pay a political price for it. He would pay a political cost, and he only is going to have so much political capital to burn. And he wants to apparently do all kinds of things like buy Greenland and take over the Panama Canal and everything else. I think it's a bit silly, frankly, but he's got a lot of objectives and priorities that are going to be very important, and he only has so much political capital. There's another factor here in regard to NATO membership, and that is NATO members are spending more on their own defense, and they are buying a lot more defense equipment. And those defense equipment orders, many of them are going to U.S. defense industry, to defense companies in the United States. And so I do not think also that Trump will want to kill the goose that laid the golden egg for U.S. defense companies. That will be an important consideration for him as well. So in all, I tend to believe that he will continue to push, he will continue to bluster and threaten. But nevertheless, I do think NATO countries at this point are in a much better place than they were in 2016 when he first took office in terms of their commitment to their own defense. And that was born not really, I mean, Trump got it going back in his first term in office, but really it was born on the back of Putin's aggression against Ukraine and the very real threat that Russia now poses to European security. So I do think that the Allies have a good story to tell, and that story will continue to develop in the coming years.
We can all hope that Trump's businessman instincts will prevail over his need to catch the headline of the day. Rose, you are a member of the high-level steering group of the Ukraine initiative that was created by Friends of Europe. I want to turn now the conversation specifically on Ukraine and what to expect for the future of Ukraine in 2025. Of course, always looming large is the question of NATO membership. They've been wanting for a formal invitation for at least 2 years now. Will this happen? What are for you the key moments to look out for in 2025?
First of all, I'm watching very keenly to see what General Kellogg is doing. This is Trump's negotiator who is supposed to be working to end this war between Russia and Ukraine. Again, on the campaign trail, Trump very famously said that he would end this conflict in one day. Well, he gave a press conference in Washington yesterday wherein he was a lot more, I would say, circumspect. He said, it'll be a week. It'll perhaps be 6 months before I meet with President Putin. And so it's interesting to me that he is not so confident that he can end the war in one day, obviously. And I'm also taking note of the fact that General Kellogg has postponed a trip to Kiev that he had scheduled for the coming days. And I just read this morning that the Ukrainian foreign minister is saying with confidence that that meeting will be rescheduled. That trip to Kiev will be rescheduled. But obviously, something is going on behind the scenes that is important in terms of moving forward the diplomacy. But it's difficult to tell how quickly that will be able to unfold. It's a very complex situation. I have written publicly that Trump cannot afford to come out of this negotiation looking like the big loser. If there's anything President Trump hates, he hates being seen as a loser, and so he is going to need to get some concessions out of Vladimir Putin. And again, I've written publicly in the Financial Times that those concessions should involve a beginning of the accession process for NATO membership, as the accession process negotiations have begun for European Union membership, and that those two processes should proceed in parallel. And Mr. Putin can be assured that accession to either the European Union or to NATO does not happen in an instant. It takes a long period of time, and particularly with an economy of the Ukrainian type that is very dependent on agricultural sales. This is going to be a major issue for European agricultural producers to welcome Ukraine into the European Union. So, to make a long story short, Putin can be assured that accession to both NATO and the European Union will not happen for some years, but the accession process would be ongoing, and that would be a clear signal, just as NATO promised last summer at the Washington summit, that Ukraine is on the road to NATO membership. So that is the position that I have taken publicly, and I continue to believe it is one that makes good sense.
During your tenure at the US State Department, you were the chief US negotiator of the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, New START for short. From your experience, a very significant experience in negotiating with Russia, will 2025 be the year that Ukraine war will end? And which form will this take? Because as of now, or since the beginning of the war, there seems to be no overlap between the wants of Russia and the wants of Ukraine that can lead in practice to a peace deal.
Yes, both Zelensky and Putin are continuing to express very strong positions in terms of their preparations for the negotiations. I think that is to be expected. Neither country will want to make premature concessions. But Zelensky is already giving some signals that he understands that the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine perhaps cannot be restored immediately. I do want to stress the point for your listeners, though, that we must never give up on the principle of territorial integrity and sovereignty for Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. This is the situation that we saw after World War II with the division of the Federal Republic of Germany from the German Democratic Republic. It ensued for the entire period until the fall of the wall and the reunification of Germany, which, by the way, we just celebrated the 35th anniversary of the reunification of Germany. But I really want to stress that it's important not to make concessions on territory that would leave Ukrainian territory permanently in Russian hands. I just think that's a very important point to stress. But Zelensky has now begun to signal that, so he's moving a bit, I would say, in the direction of the negotiating table at this moment. We will see where Mr. Putin is. He continues to have very absolutist demands going in. He hasn't yet shown any willingness to make compromise. But again, as I said a moment ago, I think it's so important that Putin not come out of this as the zero-sum game absolute winner, the absolute victor. He cannot come out of this because he wants, and he said, he wants to see Ukraine defeated, NATO defeated, and the United States of America defeated. And Trump cannot afford to come out of this war being seen as the loser. So Mr. Putin is going to have to make some concessions along the way, and we'll see how they shape up.
Absolutely. I guess the million-dollar question here is, if the war does come to a halt this year or whenever it may be, the question is how to make sure that this is not more than just a strategic pause, because Ukraine's membership to both NATO and the US very well said before, will not take place instantly or overnight. It will take time. It's a long drawn out process. So how can we make sure that if the war does come to a halt, that it won't just be started over in 2, 3, 4 years?
Right. Well, here I think we are going to have to pay some attention to European security architecture and resume some of the confidence and predictability measures that we had in place through our program. We had the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, of course, that's gone out the window. But we've also had confidence building regimes. The Vienna document has been very important in that regard and is still in place. I think we cannot simply return to those older mechanisms, but we should be looking for ways in an interim period and pursuant to whatever peace process is discussed with the Ukrainians and Russians at the table, looking at what confidence and predictability measures we can put in place along the borders, not only between Russia and Ukraine, but also between Russia and NATO and the European Union. So that will be an important part so that we, in that way, would have early warning if the Russians are returning to the fight. I do think that the Russians are significantly exhausted. They've lost an enormous amount of men and materiel, equipment, mechanized infantry. They've lost so many tanks and so much in their capability to move soldiers around on the battlefield. It's incredible. So I do think there's a certain exhaustion on the Russian side. Now they've also ramped up their defense industry with their defense plants working 3 shifts a day and so forth. But that is exhausting the Russian economy, and it's been clear in warnings from the governor of the Central Bank of Russia that Elvira Nabiullina, she is concerned about inflation levels and concerned about the economic health of the country. So Russia too is paying a cost, and I think it will be important to look for ways early on to bolster mutual predictability so that we have early warning if they are going to return to the fight, but nevertheless also to press on them the notion that they need to step back and be ready for peace for their own sakes, because their economy is suffering, their people are suffering, so many deaths and injuries of young men, and they have lost a lot in terms of their so-called modernized armed forces. Well, their modernized armed forces just has not performed and now has largely been destroyed in this war with Ukraine.
That's a very nice segue into my next question, where I want to start talking about European defense. And the reality is that there is no more time for the European Union to snooze on defense. Again, as we're speaking, in less than 2 weeks, Trump will be sitting in the Oval Office, and many question marks will slowly turn into full stops. Given Trump's isolationism, not so much how can, but what must Europe do to step up in the realm of peace, security, and defense? And is it just a matter of budget?
It's not a matter of budget, and I really have been stunned by the degree to which defense industries in Europe have not been able to adjust to the necessity of producing for this war in Ukraine. And so I hope that there will continue to be efforts to refurbish and to enable defense industries to perform better on a long-term basis. Like the acquisition processes across European countries. Germany is an example of where acquisition processes have been highly bureaucratized and stymie modernization of defense industries, because defense companies aren't going to produce if they don't have an order book that lets them understand what kinds of flows of income they're going to have in the future. So there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done in the defense industries of Europe, better coordination and consolidation. That has been an issue that's dogged European industries, even from well before I was Deputy Secretary General. But how many kinds of aircraft and tanks are produced, very different across the different industries in Europe. There needs to be interoperability, there needs to be consolidation, there needs to be organization and really structural reforms as well. I know that the European Union is thinking about and considering how to put in place defense structures, defense planning structures inside the European Union. Here, I think I would advise caution. I think it's very, very important. Again, this was from my time as Deputy Secretary General of NATO. It's very important that the priority setting process that goes on in NATO not be contradicted or in some way negated by priority setting that is going on in the European Union. If NATO, for example, is saying that we need more mechanized brigades, and if the European Union is saying we need more fighter planes, European countries cannot do both. They have to know what the right priorities are. They have to be focused on interoperability among member states, both of NATO and the EU, and they have to be really ready to spend their scarce defense euros in a way that makes sense and is not creating redundancies or essentially creating problems in terms of the ability of the armed forces to operate together in a coherent way. So that's my other piece of advice. And finally, I do think that the European Union, in terms of command structures, should bear in mind that NATO has long had in place at EUCOM under the aegis of the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, SACEUR, has had a very well-established planning process, command structure. These, I think, are resources that the European Union should be thinking about how to take advantage of, how to work together with, rather than trying to replicate such structures inside the European Union. I think that would be a redundancy that would also cause a great deal of confusion. And so it's going to be important to think about how to continue to work together, NATO and the EU, rather than at cross purposes, also in command and planning.
Who will, for you, be the face of European defense in 2025?
Oh, wow. That's a big question because the faces are changing. Obviously, President Macron of France was very keen to be seen as a leader of U.S. defense. I think Chancellor Scholz in Germany also was willing to play that role in the way that he pushed Germany to spend more on defense and to be more of a leader in this area. But both those men are due to leave office before too long, and there will be new leaders in place. I do think that the UK will continue to play a natural role as a leader in NATO and will want to place a priority on leadership in NATO because it is no longer a member of the EU. But that doesn't answer your question, Catarina, with regard to who will play the leadership role inside the European Union. There are new entrants, I would say, to the leadership role. Poland seems very eager to play that role. I will not be surprised to see other members of the so-called B9, the Central and Eastern European states, as well as the Baltic states, stepping forward, wanting to play more of a leadership role. But these are countries, despite a very firm and clear commitment to defense, that are much smaller in population terms, much smaller in resource terms, much smaller in terms of the numbers in their armed forces. And so it really, I think, does depend on the larger countries in NATO to take the leadership helm and to try to play that role, even if the United States is in some way stepping back. But again, I don't expect the Trump administration to walk away from NATO in any way. I was surprised that one of the first ambassadorial appointments that President Trump made was his ambassador to NATO. Now, this individual, of course, still needs to be confirmed by the Senate, and that won't happen until after Trump enters office. But I thought it was notable that one of the first ambassadorial appointments, if not the first, was the ambassador to NATO. So to me, that was a signal of a continued commitment to the NATO alliance.
Let's take that as a good omen. I have just one final question for you before letting you go. How will you not be losing hope during Trump's second mandate?
Well, it's going to be a wild ride. There's no question about it. And I think in the the way they seem ready to break a lot of dishes. So we say the bull in the china shop is an American expression. You let the bull into the china shop and he breaks a lot of dishes. I'm hoping that there will be opportunities to make progress on key issues that are of concern and interest to me. I mentioned at the outset that traditionally Mr. Trump has said that he wants a big arms control deal, that he wants to be the man who delivers on a big arms control deal that controls strategic nuclear weapons. And we all know that he is very keen to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, as Barack Obama was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. So if there's anything he'd like to do, he'd like to accomplish the same things that Barack Obama accomplished. So I put that out there as a kind of signal that perhaps we can make progress on strategic nuclear arms control, if not reducing nuclear weapons, at least controlling and continuing to limit them, and also bringing the Chinese to the table. So I'm going to hold that out there not only as my hopeful North Star, my hopeful lodestar, but also as my objective in terms of what I can do working on the outside to try to improve chances for this kind of success in nuclear arms control.
Rose, thank you so much.
You're welcome. It was really my pleasure.
And that's it for today's episode. I'm Catarina Vila Nova, and Policy Voices will be back again next week. Until then, goodbye.